An elderly man called Walter initially noticed a quivering figure lying beneath a bus stop bench on a chilly January morning. At first glance, it appeared to be abandoned rubbish, but then it moved a drenched, shivering puppy. Empty eyes, no collar, no footprints, and no indication of who had departed. Walter took the dog home without asking him any questions, but he was unaware that this tiny gesture of being kind would start a series of circumstances that would eventually result in a man with no heart and money whose life is about to be flipped upside down. Inverted, Walter Jensen had never been the type of man who thought that a person's big gestures were what made him unique. Lived too long, bought too many homes, and buried too many friends to believe in grandiose claims or ostentatious displays, charitable deeds. But he did think it was important to see what others were ignoring and bending down when the majority of individuals were busy performing the silent things that no one would appreciate just because. He saw the dog that morning curled up inside himself like a shattered question mark because someone had to do them. Ice over the bench. He just removed his scarf wrapped without hesitation or searching for someone more qualified. With the same gentleness he might have shown a child, he wrapped it around the trembling body and brought the animal into his arms. Walter saw that the dog was much too pale and that, despite having dense fur in certain areas, it was patchy and stiff from the cold. As he carried him the 3 blocks back to his little home in the snow, tremors ran through his coat and into his own ribs. His breath came in harsh clouds and crunched under his boots before vanishing into the morning calm. But he didn't think concerning whether the dog was ill, if it belonged to a hazardous person, or if he was acting appropriately. Simply understood that no living being should be abandoned to perish in the snow by itself. The antique wood stove in the corner of his tiny, livable home provided warmth throughout the day. He poured a dish with hot broth, placed the dog on a stack of blankets by the fireplace, and initially waited for. With eyes that were older than any creature of his size could have had, the dog simply stared at the wall without moving. Subsequently, gradually started drinking, but it wasn't until that night that the dog was. Walter was finally sleeping when he discovered a small monogram scorched into the edge of the leather collar he had previously taken off was exquisite, pricey, and too spotless to be that of a stray. Outside the frost-laced windows and the fire in the morning after, the snow continued to fall in slow, sluggish spirals. As he poured a second cup of coffee, Walter's stove crackled softly, and he glanced occasionally at the bundle of cushions in the corner where the dog is now curled up a little less. Lifeless lay, breathing evenly, his ribcage rising instead of trembling with cold, and descending in a constant, serene rhythm that provided the space with a sort of composition it hadn't known for years. But Walter hadn't given him a name yet. He didn't think that something should be named until it remained, not because he was aloof or chilly, but he became attached because life had taught him that permanence was a unique privilege. Swiftly frequently caused him to become overly motionless while he sat in his window-facing chair and observed the gradual rise and fall. He felt a slight stirring, a gentle pull from the dog's chest, not of possession, but of duty, much like he had experienced the first time he drove home with his child, daughter on the passenger seat, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, unaware of anything beyond the fact that she now needed him more than he required proof that the dog had had some food the previous evening and had licked the broth clean. Dish then silently and carefully placed his head on Walter's boot as though to indicate I'll stay for the time being, even though no gestures or words were exchanged. By mid-morning, Walter had sensed the mage land someplace deep into his chest, where old wounds and old hopes still existed. Instead of leaving the dog in the shed, Walter carried him outside to weigh him after carefully wrapping him in a flannel towel. Him on the vintage veterinary scale he had stored after doing a brief stint of volunteer work at a shelter years ago and hadn't used in years. The number that blinked was from when his wife was still living and they were discussing getting an older dog after he retired. It was nearly 10 pounds less than it should have been back at him. And as he carefully stroked his palm down the dog's spine, he whispered to himself, "Someone gave up on you way too early," when he felt the sharpness of bone beneath 2 thin furs. Yes, and that's when the collar clicked. He took it from the kitchen counter and threw it that day. Previously, and took a closer look at it in the light, it wasn't only pricey. It was handcrafted to order, with the monogram, solid brass buckle, and hand-stitched leather. The tag has a delicate, cursive C charton imprinted into it with the same kind of attention you didn't find in mass-market goods. This wasn't anything that came from a department store or a shelter. The type of collar you ordered since appearances were important and money wasn't a barrier, which told. Walter had another thought for the remainder of the day. This dog had not been lost. Rather, he had been left, establishing roots and staying put. Not because the idea startled him. He had lived long enough to see that cruelty frequently donned the mask of money, but he was unable to comprehend how. Someone may conclude it was okay to leave a creature that was so devoted and vulnerable after looking into its eyes. Later that afternoon, when the snow started to soften and the sun broke, it felt as if its life had lost significance in a snowstorm. For a moment, the dog hobbled over to where Walter was sitting on the back porch steps through the clouds and thinning, tired beams, and put his head on the elderly man's knee without hesitation. It was the slightest gesture, but to Walter, it felt like a sacred object. He reached down and scratched lightly behind the dog's ears before whispering, "You're staying, aren't you?" The dog didn't respond or move, but he also didn't leave. In the days that followed the start of the snowfall, Walter only needed that response to slowly and reluctantly melt, exposing the weary earth beneath the filthy, brittle leaves that had waited all winter for their final decomposition were half frozen and scattered, and with the slow. As the land's color returned, Walter's house, too, saw minor adjustments. Not abrupt or dramatic, but steady and, sincerely, when given enough time, warmth, and quiet, true things tend to develop. Without saying it out loud, Walter started to lean toward Charlie, and the dog, who still had no name, followed. He now moves from room to room with the calm gait of an animal terrified of being abandoned once more. But existence of someone who secretly knew that he had discovered something enduring in this elderly man's companionship. Walter spoke to him more frequently, though not in detail. So he didn't need to cling on because it wasn't going anywhere. Discussions or baby talk, but rather in the kind of gentle, continuous commentary that permeates a peaceful existence with the sound of observations made by the company regarding the weather and issues regarding his partially developed knees. Memories of his wife humming in the kitchen about things that were gone and things that never happened to his kid when she was little arrived, and the dog would tilt his head slightly, blink slowly, or rest his chin depending on whether he understood. On Walter's boot, as though only being there was a kind of listening, as though bearing witness was sufficient. And then on the 5th, when the letter arrived, it was hand-addressed in a thick cream envelope. It was stuffed inside the mailbox as if someone had put it there by hand, unwilling to stamp it and without a return address. Leave a trace, and Walter recognized a monogram in it right away when he opened it. The brief, impersonal message was typed in the corner of the folded stationery. "You can keep the dog if you find him, but don't try to give him back because he is no longer helpful to us. See Hara." Walter read the note 3 times each time, which left him even more astounded. Not because of the harshness of the words, though they were unexpected, but given their ruthless efficiency in reducing a living, breathing being to a useful possession of a failing item that was unworthy of being returned. He was unsure of who had seen it. House not yet, but based on the tone, he was able to visualize the man's physique and understood that he was wealthy. The gesture, the collar, and the paper all bore the words wealth, but someone who had never been told no or made to adore anything that didn't suit him was brittle and never sat through. Walter sat by the side of the fire that night, watching a winter storm with a hand resting on a weak body that was attempting to regain its vitality. The letter on the table unfolded, its sharp-edged lettering catching the light like a fire, and the dog was at his feet. Blade of a knife, and he considered what it meant to be useless, intended for a life to be thrown away so easily, and he considered the number of people and animals that had been thrown. Putting everything aside, he reached down and rubbed the dog using a similar logic in silence. Behind the ears, and when the name was eventually pronounced, the dog looked up but remained motionless. Didn't wag, simply looked, and Walter sensed no surprise or bewilderment in that gaze. However, he drove into town the following morning. not to the shelter, but to something that appeared to be perilously near to relief, to animal control. But instead he went to the neighborhood print shop and asked the young woman working there to assist him in. He requested her to help him identify a man named Saar since Walter Jensen retired, which was something he never believed he would do again. The silent keeper of second chances and carpenter didn't want this tale to finish in silence and a letter. Not while a man was out there who needed to know what true value was, and not when a dog named. Without ever saying a word, Charlie had demonstrated that sometimes keeping a simple item may completely alter your perspective. You understood the value of life. Walter hadn't visited the north part of town in almost 10 years. Nothing ever actually existed in Maple Hollow because it was so far away, yet because that part of the city had changed in that its quiet was insulated rather than the result of peace. Through the dense glass and the far-off lives of those who had established private realms behind keypad gates, and people who lived under ornamental hedges believed that nothing could ever touch them outside of their property limits. Following 3 days of subtly asking queries online, and with the patient assistance of Prince Shop Clark's adolescent son, one surprise contact from a former co-worker who had completed some cabinetry work for a wealthy customer 5 years earlier. That Walter discovered Caleb Remington, the guy behind the initials, was not just affluent, but also wealthy by birth, whose picture had previously been used on the luxury real estate advertisements and fundraising galas while he was in his 20s. The local paper's leisure section, along with stories on philanthropic awards and real estate innovation, development, and who, according to all outside sources, led the kind of life that people had imagined while they were unaware of it. Better yet, the address was the same as the one Walter had recorded from the envelope's watermark, and so on. He didn't know what to say when he drove there on Tuesday morning. The gate stood open as though the house had been waiting in the driveway, because they knew that stillness was no longer acceptable. Wound through well-kept lawns to a large brick home featuring massive bay windows and the type of front door, Walter parked along the edge of the pavement, and it appeared to have been constructed for a rouse that merited praise. Headed to the door with the letter folded in his pocket after adjusting his coat's collar. Charlie's old. He knocked with a collar in his hand, waited, and the man who answered was wealthy. His shirt was immaculate, his hair was flawless, and his expression was as if it were a natural part of him. The type of indifferent person who claimed that he either didn't know Walter or didn't care to answer his question. But Walter stared him in the eye, completely unconcerned, and replied, "You left something in the snow," merely holding out the collar. The man remained motionless for a minute before his gaze fell on the thing, and there was a small alteration in his facial recognition that hardly registered. Uncomfortable, I watched Caleb say, "I'll take the collar," but not. Seeing Walter's eyes once more, "I appreciate you returning it, but, as I stated in the note, I'm not getting involved anymore." "No," Walter answered in a firm, although abrasive tone. "What you mentioned in the note is that he was no longer helpful to you," Caleb said, blinking before moving back the door. Open, his face stiffening into a more recognizable protective attitude. Pride-filled statement that he is only a dog. He stated, "You want him, keep him, it's done," but instead of backing down or recoiling, Walter uttered the kind of truth that years of silent labor and silent loss had engraved on him with an accuracy that no amount of money could match. He's not merely. He trusted you with everything he said, and when it became inconvenient, you showed him what it's like to be abandoned. Tell me, Mr. Remington, who told you that Caleb's gentle but dangerous? His jaw tightened as a flash of shame flashed across his eyes. "You don't know me," he said, lowering his voice before entering the doorway completely. Walter answered, "But I know what you did." And then he turned and left without expecting or desiring an apology. Instead, he wanted one for. Charlie curled up and looked at that man to see, if only briefly, the reflection of who he had become back at home that evening. As the fur light danced on the wooden floor next to him on the sofa, Walter unfurled the final. He put it in a drawer since he no longer needed it, and the dog was no longer a mystery or someone else's. He owned the property, and in the days after Walter's visit to Caleb, it's possible that Walter did too. Remington's house, a brief contact that had created a tension that, the rhythm of a saw notched inside his coat as he clung to his thoughts like moist air. in any manner that would have been readily apparent to an outsider, but in the subtle, nearly undetectable manner that a present shifts beneath a motionless river's surface, gently pushing everything in a different direction without making a single noticeable ripple, without disclosing the altercation to anyone. Had not noted it in a journal or brought it up in his few phone conversations with neighbors or the cashier at the feed store, neither because he was ungrateful nor because it had made him uneasy. However, certain facts are meant to be carried, held like a stone in the palm of your hand, rather than being repeated. The hand, but it is sufficiently hefty to remind you that it is still yours. Actual Charlie, who had started to get stronger every day, his hunger had returned, and his fur was gradually getting thicker. The steady, patient light of safety had become more than just a part of the dullness in his eyes. Architecture of Walter's era, and even though the elderly man didn't say much, he spoke more frequently now, across the room, as if to route them to a common area rather than to engage in conversation. One morning, as Walter watched the first green hints of spring emerge through the kitchen window, they could trust, obstinately through the fence line's crusty soil, he sensed a change in his chest that didn't go away in that silence. Moment that it was related to the fact that Charlie had started to sleep through the night without waking up. The way the stillness within him had been replaced, not by anything else, made the home feel less empty. Sounds, but Walter's presence slowly altered the patterns, causing him to start traveling longer routes. Charlie set the pace in the morning, which was still slow but getting more assured as the limp from once merely waving courteously from behind. Hedge's emaciated muscles are now little more than a memory. Out to cautiously welcome them and inquire about the dog, remarking on how good he looked and how different he appeared, although no one immediately mentioned it. Walter himself seemed considerably more at ease. A man would answer a few words with a gentle smile before continuing to stroll, but each encounter left a trace of a link that he hadn't noticed until it started to reappear in fragments. Then one afternoon, when going through an old toolbox in the shed, planned to eventually repair the chicken coop's damaged lock, despite the fact that the chickens had long since been swapped out for Peaceful Eve, a picture he hadn't seen since the week his wife sat on the porch and their daughter departed for college. Her head tilted as she walked, while holding a black Labrador with a white streak on its snout. Back laughing, the sun glinting in the corners of her eyes as it usually did when she wouldn't. He remained there for a long time, holding back, the picture quivering a little in his hand, not out of emotion, but because of recollection, and he reflected on the years he had spent thinking that the warmth in that picture had been permanently. The past, inaccessible and unrecoverable until the appearance of a trembling dog, under a bench on a chilly morning, and while tending to it, had unintentionally reawakened a portion of. Walter ignited the fire early that night because he believed it had been dormant forever. After they had finished eating, he relocated the recliner and filled 2 bowls, one with soup and the other with kibble that had been softened with broth. Charlie cuddled up next to Haight, who had a blanket over his knees and a poro over his boot. Like an anchor outside, the wind started to rise once more, gently grazing the house as if attempting to recall something, to go back, but the walls within remained sturdy, not against the cold, but against the emptiness, because there was now a story where there had previously been silence. And spring was just getting started, sliding into Maple Hollow's contours like warm breath after a prolonged period of quiet, with the final ice crust slipping into shadows where the sun had disappeared. Walter started to, once believed to be forever small and sealed, it could suddenly start to expand again without any grand revelation. Disturbance, but by subtly reintroducing movement, taking a longer walk at sunset, and having a chat with a neighbor. The reappearance of birdsong in the early morning before the kettle whistled Charlie now meant that it didn't stop at the mailbox. He had completely merged himself. He was heavier, stronger, and no longer moving as he had anticipated, with every door closing in his face. Into the house's rhythm, not just as a visitor or even a urinate, and in that dog's peaceful presence once discarded as an undesirable item, Walter is now consistently provided with food, shelter, and quiet respect on a daily basis. Discovered that he was not thinking, walking, or feeling in the same way that could be readily outlined. But it wasn't until late April during one of their morning sessions that it changed the way he carried each hour. Strolls past the town's edge, where Walter started to notice the dirt route CD close to the old river embankment. Something else was going underneath, but it was pressing against the edge of his consciousness instead, like the weight of a storm long before the clouds arrived, and it appeared as an ordinary automobile that made. It was noticeable since it showed up 3 times in a short period of time. Its driver's windows were tinted, and it was constantly parked across from the field engine, never leaving the house, never checking, but first obviously not there by accident. Walter remained silent, attributing it to coincidence or paranoia, the kind of unsettling notion that arises when I've lived long enough to understand that danger can occasionally be disguised by quiet rather than commotion. However, after a fourth appearance, he parked on the far end of his street so that he could see the porch, but he knew the pattern wasn't imagined at the time, so he went far enough to act as like he wasn't observing. When the letter arrived, it wasn't mailed, folded, placed in an envelope, or politely addressed. It was just neatly positioned on the porch railing beneath a tiny stone to purposefully silence the strong, manly handwriting was clearly studied, and you've made your. Let's move on. There was no name, no return address, and no immediate threat, but the message was sufficiently obvious that someone had become uneasy about being seen after being informed that there was a. Walter made no mention of the man who had dared to interrupt a story that was meant to vanish into snow and forgetfulness. It wasn't to the widow on the other side, but rather to the woman at the print shop who had assisted him in finding the initials. Sycamore had begun to wave more frequently as she went past, not even to the child next door, who occasionally. He understood in the silence and helped him lug sacks of mulch up the stairs. Experienced manner of someone who had encountered conflict and its repercussions that. This was a test to gauge resolve rather than a warning intended to spar conversation, and Walter, despite his advanced age, although he was sluggish, he was not a man who enjoyed conflict or victory, and had no plans to leave just because. Charlie's body stretched across the fireplace as he slept that night because Power had become anxious. Walter sat in his chair and held the note to the carpeting with the easy ease of a creature that at last thought it was safe. New, and he considered not just what had been done, but also what hadn't been done in the subsequent sidevents. Several instances of cruelty demonstrating how easy some people assumed that once a gesture was buried, everyone would ignore it. Deep enough in debt or distance, he was steady and no longer angry. Because certain things are worthwhile to see through to the end, not for retaliation or even for traditional justice. But just to serve as a reminder to the world and some of its inhabitants that not everyone forgets that not everyone leaves, and the subsequent time that vehicle drove around the block, Walter stood on the edge of his yard, not watching from behind the curtain as the engine slowed its window, squared their shoulders firmly, not to provoke or threaten, but to inform them that the elderly man was still there, had just started to appear by the time the collar was tucked in and the note was burned in the wood furnace, gently placed back into the drawer next to the fireplace. It is now a sign of something rather than a threat or even a memory. Walter discovered that he was thinking more about the peaceful area and less on the man who had abandoned Charlie. Since that chilly winter morning, when everything had started, a space had developed between him and the outside world. Initially appearing to be a protective wall, it now reveals itself to be more like a door with a jar left there, possibly waiting for. Charlie was now sacred at home, and something or someone had started to step through him, way flinching like an uncertain animal, but following Walter with a confidence that had never been there before, of his welcome, but in a creature's serene, shadowy gait that had made peace. With a sense of belonging who no longer felt the need to prove himself in every area as he had gradually learned, and no one here would send him away without a ceremony, but he was still under the warmth. Something else had started to emerge out of this shared rhythm and the gentleness of days spent in silent company. Not precisely fear or worry, but a kin tug tore like a thread. When the morning news was on, I could hear one that hummed at strange times when everything seemed too quiet. When the birds suddenly stopped talking and the clouds became heavier over the ridge, he started to Observe minor details, such as a tire trace on the edge of his gravel driveway where no guest had parked, and a call. The moment he answered an unknown call, a well-dressed stranger appeared through the window of a. Across town, a diner was observing for a little too long before vanishing behind a menu. Why on there? Coincidences at best, forgettable at worst. But Walter had lived long enough for his own to matter a lot to anyone else. To understand that when your intuition begins to whisper, it means that someone is listening. This occurred during one of their evening strolls shortly after sunset, with the gravel road still warm from the day's heat and the aroma of lilacs permeating the air. Charlie's ears abruptly stopped, his body remained motionless, and he gazed at the tree line on the far side of the field. He was alert, but not particularly anxious. For a brief second, there was nothing, followed by a brief flash of movement that was gone in a way Walter hadn't seen in months. Charlie remained motionless and continued to observe until it could be described, and Walter. The instantaneous steadying of the heart occurs only when suspicion is ultimately overcome by certainty. Its readiness to return home after double-checking was what had changed, not the threat itself. The locks, not out of fear, but because grief and caution have a way of. As he grew older, Walter stood in the kitchen listening to a gentle blues tune on the radio when he realized that he could stop now and no one would blame him, and that the true weight he was experiencing had nothing to do with danger. He had already gone above and beyond what most people would have done to save the dog, and when the dog confronted the man, he responded with presence and silence. Walter understood in his heart that the question that was thrust upon him was not one of responsibility, but rather one of truth. Charlie wasn't the only one who had been cast aside. After his wife died, he had also cast aside parts of himself in various ways, had placed them on shelves after folding them up, telling himself that solitude was more difficult to handle on smaller days. Was crucial because Charlie was here and the world was gently but firmly pressing at the limits of his porch, posing the true problem. Was whether he was prepared to risk letting more life in by opening the door wider, rather than whether he had done enough. Consequently, as the evening grew silent, Charlie dozed off, his head laying like a weight on Walter's foot. That soothed rather than restrained the elderly man as he sat in his window-facing chair, pen in hand, and started writing. A letter to someone else, not to Caleb or the authorities, but to. The editor prepared a lengthy, meticulous script that included a story about a dog, a query about worth, and the first words that were. When the letter eventually arrives, sometimes the things we discard are the ones that teach us what we forgot. Showed up in. Yet for whatever reason, it carried more weight than a dozen editorials full of righteous noise. Land a room that had been filled with whispers for a long time, but it was more like a roar than a throat clearing. Despite Walter had just planned for it to release the tension that had been building inside of him for weeks. Quietly started to change beneath the reverberation of those straightforward, weighty words. Began with gentle, lingering glances from nobody at the bakery, gas station, or grocery store. Aggressive, non-intrusive, yet the type of glances that implied because the former teacher knocked on Walter's door, the neighbor across the street brought over a warm pie. Door to inform him that she had read the letter out loud to her children and asked if he would think about coming to the Lee. A librarian inquired hesitantly if Charlie might be included in a story wall about rescued animals that she wished to display. Walter didn't immediately accept any of these offers, not because he didn't want to, but rather because something in. He continued to reject the notion of a peaceful existence centered on solitude and little EIS, particularly since he had never looked for it. But as he observed Charlie, every evening, growing stronger and heavier as you curl up by the fire and take deep breaths with he sensed something easing within himself, a sort of loosening around the tranquility that no longer seemed borrowed but truly earned. Spine that suggested that what they were creating together would be both visible and therapeutic, but at the same time, the community warmed and opened, smiles lengthened, and words grew darker and more genuine. A car parked 2 homes away, and an undercurrent that wasn't loud or violent started to rise beneath the surface. Down for hours with a driver who never left a string of block number calls that ended as soon as he responded to the silent return of the same spotless, dark automobile that was driving by his house at strange hours, its windows open, its goals hidden behind tinted glass. Walter initially remained silent because he was terrified, but he also understood that naming some things too soon could cause people to question what they hadn't seen yet. So he waited, observed, and listened with the same level of faith, intuition that had guided him through a lifetime of circumstances much riskier than a man in a suit. Only when the second letter arrived, this time via mail, wrapped neatly inside, did I pretend not to stare. An envelope with the initials C so thick it could have passed for a contract, subtly engraved on the flap, along with a watermark that suggested attorneys and stillness. And Walter understood that the narrative had struck a deeper chord than anyone had anticipated. You've stated what you wanted to say, so now take a step back. It is no longer your place to get involved in this issue. You have already been warned and won't be warned again, was the polished frost of entitlement attempting to pass for something else. Yet there was no signature, return address, or obscenity. Finality, and Walter grasped the letter in his unshaken hands and saw full well that this was now about control rather than the dog, ownership, reputation, or even sorrow. Because people like Caleb Remington had always assumed that the world would change to suit their pain and taken their choices, as well as the idea that a retired carpenter without a platform or money, and they found it not only inconvenient, but unbearable that someone without a taste for spectacle could subtly defy that expectation. Charlie was sleeping at his feet as Walter sat by the window at night with the lights turned down, the second letter tucked in. In the drawer next to the old ashtray, beneath the first, he reflected on how odd it was that a man who had spent half of his life building houses, but he had only recently started to grasp the significance of creating a space that felt protected rather than with alarms or locks, but with honesty, and how, occasionally, it wasn't sufficient to save. It was occasionally necessary to hold the mirror up to the person who threw it. And when a few nights later, someone left a new set of deep tire tracks close to his shed's edge, which were obviously off the drive and meant to be seen, Walter didn't panic, didn't call the police, and didn't even bring it up to the neighbor who walked her dog by his porch each morning, because he was aware that the danger that was about to come wasn't violence, but he was prepared for the endurance test, which was on a languid, cloudy morning is the kind that comes with a heavy layer of silence and the weight of fog on one's shoulders. Enough to give the impression that the house's walls were a little bit closer than ours, and the radio was turned off for once. Not because he had neglected to turn it on, but he discovered that recently there were specific times of the day when the sound of he had almost reluctantly realized that the outside world was more of a distraction than a comfort. Felt he may learn more about what was ahead from the silence during those hours than from any broadcast ever could. Ever sensitive to even the slightest changes in atmosphere and energy, Charlie Zahn had started to stay near him rather than go out of tension or panic, but with an animal's quiet, purposeful motions that understands the type of alertness that just stays there without barking or complaining. The smaller creek body was settled, but never completely at rest, with eyes following the passage and ears twitching toward the entrance. It had been more than a week since the second letter, but they were protecting more than just the house's perimeter. Even though there had been no overt conflict, no break-in, and not even another unwelcome guest, Walter could feel the strain, and as the community around him carried on with its happy springtime activities, lawns were mowed. He sensed balls being thrown down the sidewalk by barbecue-smoked children. People paused before greeting him or looked at his porch for too long, allowing the rumor to grow than he had intended, and that it had reached individuals who it was never meant to reach, including one of those individuals was CLA Remington. If such things can ever be termed that, he met her by chance. Mishaps when purchasing sealant and nails at the hardware shop in Maine, where she was standing in front of gardening tools, looking through a notebook, frowning, and not wearing clothing that suggested she was wealthy, but rather, Walter was a person who had learned to navigate the world despite it. He wore jeans, rolled sleeves, and boots with heel. Had only seen her once, years ago, when she appeared at a community historical society benefit, beside her brother with a smile that appeared courteous, but unrelated to the type of smile that someone used to. This time, she looked up, drew his attention, and played a part in rooms where the air always felt just a bit too thin. Hesitated, but not because I was uncomfortable, but because I knew you were the one from the. She stated in the letter, not as a query, but as a fact. Walter, how could anyone have predicted? Anonymous, who had never signed his name before, only nodded since acting was no longer necessary, especially since the consequences had already discovered him. CLA closed her mouth without grinning. Notebook approached and spoke in a way that surprised him. Not from a Remington, and definitely not from the same initials that had threatened him from behind the pricey stationer murmured, "I'm sorry," in response to what he. Walter first didn't respond because of how he handled everything. Because he didn't trust her, but because he did, and he discovered that belief was more difficult to bear than rage. Particularly when it came from a family that had been keeping the rainfall for the most of its existence, while others were made to stroll behind, and they conversed quietly beside the potting bags for almost 20 minutes. Charlie, the letters, the automobile, the dirt, and the piled bird feeders. And regarding how she was inside admitted by silence. If anything more occurs, if he, call me first when you get home, please. Walter put the number next to the drawer with the letters on the collar. And the pictures, his small narrative archive, and he spent a long time sitting on the porch with Charlie, observing the sun descend beneath the trees, sensing the wind shifting course once more, and not considering what would come next, but rather how, for the first time since everything started, he was no longer confronting. By itself, the night it occurred wasn't noteworthy in any way. There were storms in the sky, no radio warnings, and the leaves that bordered the porch were shaking. Yet there was the type of burden that rests on your shoulders rather than with noise or motion. Yet everything that normally breathes around you suddenly became still, including the birds that fly. Calm the wind that PS is using in the middle of the faint silence that permeates the room. Between the sound of a heartbeat and a tap on the door, you can't help but wonder whether something is. Just before starting, Walter had completed replenishing Charlie's bowl with heated broth, which is traditionally poured over dry food. When the lights flickered in the living room instead of inconsistent, it had become a sort of ceremonial power outage, but in the exact bien rhythmic blink of a signal being transmitted and received, as if the house's circuits hesitated before verifying their presumption that anything was outside. It wasn't right, so he cautiously approached the window, not out of fear but because, when he drew the curtain, he remembered that presence gathers energy and fear wastes it. Back just enough for his eyes to catch the distinctive gleam of metal far away. Near the house to see a passing vehicle parked inside the line of his own driveway, rather than on the street, the engine. Sitting there in that steady, quiet hum that feels more like breathing than gearbox. Whoever had arrived wanted to be seen, so he opened the door without going outside, his hand lying on. Charlie is already by his side at the edge of the screen, watching without ordering, without growling, and not barking. The type of stillness that says, "I remember," and then Caleb, without a coat, emerged from the vehicle. Bodyguard without a driver. Simply him wearing a fitted shirt with the collar open and his stance relaxed in that particular manner. Someone wear it when they want to seem innocuous, but are actually trying to hurt someone with every action they make. Jagged Walter believed we might speak. His tone was informal, but too smooth, like glass stretched over something. He didn't have to say anything, because when a man who threatens people in letters starts to come up in person, it's. Caleb took a cautious, deliberate step forward. Not because he had discovered courage, but rather because he was losing control. Maintaining eye contact. "You've caused quite a commotion, Mr. Jensen. The story, the letters, and I didn't think enough of your." Nevertheless, Walter said nothing, allowing the silence to elapse between. They were like a wire being pulled across a canyon, tighter and tighter, to see which side would release first. "I didn't." Caleb finally shifted his weight, and his tone slipped, saying, "Come here to argue. I came here to provide resolution, even if it was only a little bit towards something less composed. You may return to your life after this, and I can return to mine. Games, no more letters, and no more shadow gazing." And that's when Walter took a slow, deliberate step out onto the porch, speaking quietly, and Even after years of only talking when it was important, he said, "You think this is a game where the inquiry landed as revelation, Caleb, rather than as an accusation." Blinked, clearly taken aback by how straightforward it was. "This isn't about the dog anymore." And Walter went on, "With each breath, you add weight rather than volume. This is the point at which you recognize the narrative you created. It wasn't completely sealed off, that someone saw through it and revealed the truth, and now." Caleb's jaw tightened as he said, "You don't know how to make that story disappear without getting your hands dirty." Walter went down to the bottom stair, near enough now that the porch was louder than anything he could have said. Light said, "You don't scare me," and etched lines and shadows on his face. Additionally, you don't frighten him by nodding at Charlie, who stayed motionless, his eyes steady, his body poised, not because he detected danger, but since he was aware of this man's identity long before Walter was. Caleb didn't reply. Instead, he turned and he walked back to his car carefully and whispered, "Be careful, Mr. Jensen, not everyone," before unlocking the door without looking back, "is on your side in this town." And he drove away without a tire screech or a slam of doors, only to flee into the night with the smooth glide of affluence, still thinking that stillness is something you can purchase if enough checks are written. Walter remained there for a while after the automobile vanished and the silence returned. He moved cautiously to the yard, perhaps unsure if it was safe to return, and when he eventually turned to enter, like a soldier who has witnessed enough to know that fights don't finish when the noise stops, Charlie followed closely but calmly. They come to an end when someone refuses to go, and the next day arrives without any fanfare or thunder, but with that odd, confusing silence that occasionally descends on a town in the morning following a significant event. Occurred, but nothing seems to have altered, at least not on the surface. When the air feels a little heavier, the sky appears somewhat lower, and the well-known contours of everyday life appear to be drawn with a gentler sounds, as if the entire world is awaiting the next event before settling into its typical pace. Walter rose earlier than normal, not because he was having trouble sleeping, but because his sleep had been so little and sporadic that disintegrated as soon as his eyelids closed, but due of a change in his internal environment, the type that only shows up once enough time has elapsed to distill each query to its most basic form. And what he could no longer deny the clarity that persisted behind all the threats, warnings, and silent visits wouldn't stop by itself, and silence, no matter how well-meaning or well-maintained, was no longer the safer course of action. Caleb Remington was relying on this permission, so he dressed meticulously and slowly while maintaining quiet discipline of a guy who recognized the importance of preparation, not because he anticipated conflict, but rather because he realized that. As he poured his coffee, he fed Charlie and took the next hard step. He felt uneasy as he stepped out onto the porch to observe the light carefully extending across the perimeter of his property. When a guy stops waiting for something, he feels a sense of calm rather than dread. The letter he composed that morning was not written in anger, nor was it for someone else to do what he knows must be done. Shaped by resentment or guilt, the voice was low but unrelenting, of someone who opted to speak up despite seeing what most others would rather not to blame me, but to illuminate, making impossible to avoid. And the contents, despite being straightforward, it possessed the kind of weight that only truth can have when positioned in the hands of someone who was at last prepared to take action. He forwarded copies to the editor of the letters from the local Humane Society, the sheriff's office, and the newspaper, along with a thorough description of Charlie's desertion, the names involved, and the calm intimidation that had accompanied the meticulously documented and preserved photos he had taken, not because he had anticipated using them, but he had discovered long ago that some individuals only comprehend shame in relation to. He was wrapped in evidence, and he didn't hope for drama or applause, wanted nothing more than for the truth to slowly filter in like light through a dusty window, unquestionable and unavoidable once seen by late afternoon on the 1st. The response came from CLA, not the newspaper or the sheriff, and she contacted him immediately. Her voice was composed, but had the distinct edge of a woman who had recently learned that she had been kept in the dark for far longer than she should have been. And even if her remarks lacked precision, they were blazing with the silent rage of someone whose allegiance had been abused by HEK, she claimed, and Walter said nothing, allowing before gently asking, "Let the weight of that word sink in. What happens now?" She responded that he wouldn't see it coming because she had already begun the process. Retaliation was an accountability, not a scandal, and at that very moment, Walter realized that the story no longer exclusively belonged to him, Charlie, or even the peaceful area of Maple Hollow. Where it had started, it now existed in the hands of others, carried on by those who, in their own manner, made the decision to enter the uncomfortable realm when silence is no longer acceptable and change is required. Inheritance that evening, long after the sun had set, Walter sat on the porch. Charlie stretched next to him as the stars above him blinked softly, filling the air with the smell of wood smoke and earth. He breathed deeply and contentedly, and even though he didn't say anything, Walter was certain that something had ended between them that day. Not with a show or a dispute, but with making the decision to speak, to stand, to not back down, and to enter. The wind drifted slowly and softly in the distance, and someplace past the trees. However, in that methodical, steady manner that conveys a promise rather than a threat, as though to say you didn't flinch, but the air on the following day had changed, but not in temperature or scent as a result of it. Not in the way the trees that border the perimeter of Walter's small home move or the apparent pattern of clouds above yard, but I understand the feeling when something spoken has reached a threshold, when there is a silent vibration of consequence in the ground beneath your feet, and even the most familiar places seem a little out of sync, like a song you've heard your entire life. Walter saw it right away, not because he was searching for it, but because it was abruptly performed half a note too slowly, due to the fact that he could no longer afford to ignore what had at this point become unavoidable. And as he made each movement based on habitual simplicity, he grew more conscious of the stress. Like a tort, it runs just beneath the surface of everything. Not loud or evident, but nevertheless distinct. Threads span the day, silently and imperceptibly waiting for the moment it would eventually lose his temper. Charlie had also seen a change in his demeanor, and his motions more accurately, his gaze following every car that passed with the intense serenity of a sentinel instead of the idle curiosity of a business. And even while he didn't appear distressed, he suddenly had a calmness about him that had nothing to have to do with relaxation and understanding that the tranquility they had created together was not a guarantee of peace. Disturbed doesn't always come back free, and the first call arrived just in the afternoon. The local paper's editor spoke in a measured, courteous, but abrasive tone, with the anxious energy that frequently results from feeling torn between duty and the need to protect. To publish in a place where regional outlets shared it, and it had already started to spread far beyond their small town, through community pages and, in his words, igniting a broader discussion regarding accountability for abandonment and the covert systems that led cruelty to. With the composed reserve of someone who had put on the mask of respectability, Walter thanked him, had previously foreseen the outcome of his decision, who knew that the instant you introduce truth into the world, you also give up control over how far it goes, and who, long before hitting the last button, had agreed to that surrender. Envelope closed, but the knock on the door half an hour later, rather than the editor's call, was what made all the difference. The sun was at its zenith. The house was typically filled with gentle shadows, and the brook of wood was growing. Walter responded slowly to Charlie's question as the heat abruptly dropped completely still. He didn't growl or bark. Instead, he was just being there, as only people who have been broken and rebuilt can be. Caleb Remington was standing on the porch, but he wasn't a reporter, a neighbor, or a sheriff's deputy version of himself who had pulled up in a shiny automobile, his haughtiness woven into every move. This was a man who had, unshaven and sleep-deprived, he clutched a folder in one hand that was heavy with papers and nothing else, not even the customary shield of posture, in the other. Expression, just a bare face that appeared older in some way, like the assurance mask. had finally cracked, exposing a vacuum I need to discuss rather than a villain. Before Walter could respond, Caleb continued, "You," in a low, short voice, just saying something before everything else happens, without threatening or requesting anything. Becomes official, Walter stood down as a challenge rather than an invitation. And Caleb, who had already attempted to calm his fears, entered the house almost carefully, gaze darting momentarily to Charlie, whose serene demeanor now appeared to sap the man's remaining reserves of. There was a prolonged period of stillness before Caleb sat down, his physique already weak, positioned the folder on the table like a confession, and uninvited on the edge of the chair closest to the fireplace, his hands quivering a little as he spoke without his customary assurance. It was never about the dog, but rather how he made me think of Walter standing with his arms raised. Folded remained silent since he realized that this moment needed space, not interruption. The type of place where a guy is forced to face the reality of his actions without receiving the comfort of absolution. Caleb carefully opened the folder, exposing paperwork, letters, and statements that Walter didn't need to read. Material would now be disseminated through judicial systems and government organizations, but the disclosure was not for Walter's profit. It was for his own gain. I've centered everything around Caleb's control, maintained every aspect of my life, including my relationships, businesses, and public personas. Yet when I saw him, after telling the driver to get off of me, I sat there on that chilly street and didn't. I buried what I used to feel before I stopped allowing anything to reach me yet. And I saw a puppy. Walter remained silent, since he understood that this was the start of a reconciliation and not the conclusion of a dispute. Considering that genuine must come without promise, the quiet that ensued after Caleb's admission was neither. It felt forced or unnatural, and it was thick, nearly tangible, like the space between the Walter's last breath and the first tear were silent, and the man was an ass. A representation of unbridled power or conceit masquerading as affluence, but actually representing something considerably more dangerous and distant. More recognizable, a person who has so well hidden his suffering under layers of entitlement to control and cultivated detachment that he had lost sight of the voice of his own conscience until it returned to him as a dog. Walter stood there, desolate on a chilly street, with only his breath and his memories remaining, not out of pride or judgment, but because some situations are too delicate to sit through since they involve someone's quiet fall, another person's defense to comfortably interfere. So he allowed Caleb to sit there with his hands still on the weight of his words continued to press down like a weight, and folder eyes were locked on a spot somewhere beyond the hearth. Tide he had attempted to contain for too long, only to discover too late that I had no idea what I was doing because the flood had already entered. Caleb stated at last. The words were brittle and dragging, as if they had been practiced inside for years before being shouted out loud. Not when I left him. I believe my assistant's hesitant voice was catching when I instructed him to make sure no one found out. I believed it would go away like everything else I didn't want to deal with if I ignored it for a long enough period of time. Walter gave him a startled look instead of one of sympathy, something that most guys don't shatter from a single choice, but rather from the gradual deterioration of decisions made without consideration. And when he eventually, his calm, deep voice conveyed the weight of someone who understood that once the truth is presented, it doesn't need. You left him because he reminded you of something genuine, and every word he spoke was purposefully sculpted to be heard. Anything sloppy that you were unable to organize into a story that would have made you appear excellent. And as he turned to face you, that day, he saw need rather than power, and that scared you more than anything else. Consequences that could ever happen. But Caleb gulped hard and watery eyes. He mumbled, "Deflection. I deserve what's coming." Walter moved forward, but not with triumph, but with a threat that transforms a space from frigid to cozy without altering the temperature, and he touched the folder to anchor it rather than claim it. He stated clearly that what you deserve isn't up to par, having spent a lifetime creating things that are designed to last. To me, but what you do after that is, and something changed at that precise instant, not audibly, not visibly, but profoundly, as Caleb Remington was not being managed for the first time in his life. Either respected or frightened, that he was being held responsible by someone who had nothing to gain, no reputation to enhance, and no empire to defend. And when that truth is presented without agenda, as a means of piercing the armor, there is no scandal or litigation. Walter moved away from Charlie, who had still curled up. The whole time, he slowly raised his head and met Caleb's gaze. With rage or fear, but with the calm, unblinking eyes of someone who had once endured being abandoned and had no interest in seeing a man attempt to defend it. And that's when Caleb snapped, not dramatically or loudly, but with a sound so low it hardly registered. The body folds forward slightly, the hands unclench from the folder, the breath is sucked in and never completely released, and the shoulders quivering in the faint, uncontrollable manner that people do when they recognize the walls they constructed to protect themselves and have left them empty. Instead, he sat there without speaking or crying, disintegrating, and Walter, aware that nothing he said would be more helpful than the silence that already held the room open, walked, silently made his way to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, set it on the table, and went back to his chair. Sat as a man who recognized the truth, not as a judge or a witness. Confrontation is about remaining motionless when the truth is revealed, not about overcoming someone else's interpretation of events. When it eventually arrived, the days that followed were not marked by celebration or acknowledgement, nor did they bear the sound of praise or vindication, and did not significantly alter the global landscape in any way in Fay and discussions at the neighborhood diner that veer back toward well-known topics like weather patterns, grandchildren, and the irise's early bloom beside the creek. But for Walter, Charlie, and maybe in a more intricate and distinct manner for Caleb Remington as well, everything had subtly and irreversibly changed the course of the judicial procedures, which started out slowly and procedurally, the sort of grind that moves, with the intentional weight of long-standing safeguards for those who construct them. Yet the letters Walter and the voice of Claire, who publicly and resolutely supported the truth when her brother made one more attempt to undermine the tale, had created a current powerful enough to carry the truth through all attempts to conceal it under formalities and courteous denials. But the true justice, if it can be called that, came from the almost silent place rather than the courtroom. People started to recall it in an intangible sense because of the vacant seat at the country club function where Caleb had previously delivered a speech about community duty that was noticeably empty. It came from the board of the animal sanctuary that appointed Walter as its honorary advisor and named its new emergency intake wing Charlie's place, not for political influence or cash, but rather for his unwavering, uncompromising belief that no life should be thrown away without someone by its side. But Charlie's actions were primarily the result of the M&S. No longer recoiled when a door closed because of how neighbors would pause to touch his ears without hesitancy from the manner in which Walter, a man of routine and seclusion, now strolled a extended loop around the town, nodding to people you know, and perhaps pausing for coffee, sometimes with after reading his letter in class, a shy young student asked if she might write about him for her hero summer essay. Since he had never considered himself brave, he had laughed at that with gentleness rather than contempt, obstinate enough to remain upright while others turned away. And during the calm afternoon hours when the floor was dimly lit and the shadows cast by the sycamore outside formed slow lines around the walls, he frequently found himself reflecting on what had been returned rather than what had been lost, not in the manner of he had long since given up on atonement as a practical idea, yet it can nevertheless take the shape of something being restored. Not because of time, but because he refused to act as though it didn't matter. He saved the letters intact. He was resentful not because of awards, but because he understood that history repeats itself if it is allowed to fade. Perhaps long after he has passed away, someone will discover the drawer, open the old pages, and realize the truth is, justice is not always quick and not always loud, but both are still achievable if someone is prepared to hold. When no one else is left, Charlie will be older, stronger, and burdened with safety and a diet founded on survival had evolved into the type of companion that didn't need continual care and didn't follow at the heels. or require performance, but rather persisted as a sort of constant presence in every space and in every breath. Every choice felt so normal that it was no longer noteworthy, but necessary. Like warmth, like air, like the steady, familiar sound of a pulse. But Walter continued to talk little and preferred the language of routine and movement. But there were occasional and constant. He would sit on the porch with Charlie at his feet, close to twilight, and let himself. He never included the truth, the facts that couldn't be published, testified to, or sworn under, in the letters. "You saved me too, Oath." He would whisper without anticipating a response, requiring one, but putting the words down like a stone on the ground, not to be carried, but just to mark the location where a significant event occurred, and at the times when the wind moved. He recognized the specific shade of gold that only appears at the onset of night as it passed between the trees and the sky, with total clarity that every decision, every quiet, and because some stories don't end with punishment, the risk had been worthwhile. They conclude with presence, and some triumphs are about what you choose not to take back rather than what you do. If this tale resonated with you or reminded you of the strength and quiet power of kindness, please allow it to be read again. The courage to stand up without yelling, or the straightforward principle that no life should ever be wasted, then perhaps you'll stay a little while longer, because there are more tales like this one where the forgotten are made unforgettable. Second chances lead to new beginnings. So, thank you if you're still here. And join us for the next one when you're ready. It might stick with you longer than you anticipate.